The Francis Xavier Cheney Lectureship in Pastoral Theology is offered every second year at Berkeley Divinity School at Yale. This lecture, given in memory of Francis Cheney, reflects his own legacy and work here at Berkeley and Yale, which was described by his friends at the time the lectureship was established as an endeavour to transcend doctrinal and vocational differences and so to address the central concern of the minister as a member of the Christian community, that is, the care of the whole people of God. We're delighted that our Cheney lecturer for 2020, who is coming to us again across a great distance via recorded means, is Dr. Jenny Te Pā. Dr. Te Pā was the first Maori person to complete a degree in theology at the University of Auckland, and her life has continued to be one of blazing new trails and setting precedents. She undertook doctoral studies at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and became head of Te Rau Kahikatea, the Maori Theological College, which is a part of St. John's College in Auckland. She was the first Indigenous lay woman to hold such a post in the Anglican Communion and remained in that role for over 20 years. She's been convener of the International Anglican Peace and Justice Network and an active member of the Anglican Communion's networks for Indigenous people and for women. She embodies her call in her own words thus: "As an Indigenous Anglican laywoman and academic leader, it seems only fitting that as a descendant of both the original messenger missionaries and of those responsible for the establishment and nurturing of the original missionary church in Aotearoa, I would accept responsibility for narrating something of the story of a provincial post-colonial Anglican church, which has of recent times sought to redeem its past and to now model to itself and beyond to the worldwide communion within which it so proudly belongs, something of our uniquely South Pacific claim of being God's gospel people, people of prophetic boldness, of moral courage, of unending faithfulness." We have a lecturer this evening who has distinguished herself with prophetic boldness. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the Cheney lecturer for 2020, Dr. Jenny Te Pā Daniel.
My brothers and sisters in Christ, tēnā koutou katoa. Warm greetings from the backyard, my backyard of my home in Aitutaki. I'm so honoured to stand before you all, knowing as I do that this might just be the most globally dispersed and completely invisible audience I've ever been so uniquely blessed to share my thoughts, my fears and my hopes with. I do pray though that this might be the last experience of so doing, because as I'm sure you will agree, there is nothing technology can ever do to substitute for the sacredness of human presence. For indeed is not the deep reassurance of human touch, the indescribable joy of human warmth, the exquisite and enduring tenderness of human love. Are these not the very things we were created to give and to receive? The gifts which enable each one of us to express across the chasms of humanly created difference the very essence of being fully human. Now, before I go another step further, let me not forget, as an Indigenous woman, that it is right and proper for me to first offer my most humble respects to the ancestors and to the lands upon which my new alma mater, Berkeley Divinity School at Yale, stands. For it is those Indigenous ancestors who once stood proud and confident in knowing and in living faithfully into the inextricable connection between people and land, the greatest of God's created treasures entrusted into each other's care. It is therefore to those Indigenous ancestors who I understand to be the Quinnipiac people, to whom every single graduate and beneficiary, every single member of the staff and faculty of Berkeley Divinity School at Yale must surely stand indebted. For as with all Indigenous understandings, binding human relationships are formed at every first moment of encounter. And these relationships continue to exist, irrespective of dishonour and irrespective of any and all efforts to either deny or denigrate what has historically occurred. Such efforts, as we are all now being deservedly apprised of, has been the way of the Latin damnatio memoriae, the hidden or the politically expedient erasure of history. Globally, in large part because of relentlessly courageous Indigenous activism, this politically and academically enshrined tradition of erasure is now no longer escaping critical gaze. All over the world, spurred on by oppressed, marginalised and enslaved stones now crying out for justice, more strongly, more urgently than ever before, it has mercifully become almost impossible for any of us to deny our moral, our legal, our spiritual duty toward redeeming any and all aspects of our inglorious histories. It is good to see so many individual ecclesial institutions beginning to self-examine, including, I note, the substantive project to combat racism being undertaken by the parent institution, Yale Divinity. But do we, as global Anglicans, even know where to start, considering our own complicity in perpetuating so much of the sheer arrogance of imperialism, that which is at the heart of our faith tradition, that which is at the heart of any and all acts of erasure? I want initially at least to explore this question through the lens of the priest and pastoral theologian in whose name I am today honoured to speak. When I asked my esteemed friend Dean McGowan to tell me a little something about who Francis Cheney was, I did so because I was looking respectfully for insight into what perhaps this learned and holy man of God would approve of in terms of a lecture offered up in his name. I was especially drawn to a small section of his profile which said, in impressively quaint language, Francis has striven to impress upon his students that a truly well-educated clergy is one which knows how to use its knowledge to nourish all manner of people, that the measure of learning is the charitable actions to which it gives rise, that quite simply, true piety is acting what one knows. Translating this into 2020 speak, I concluded Francis would likely approve of my contribution, providing it traversed the essential principles he has outlined, and which I have taken the liberty of extrapolating as the principles of unconditional and just inclusivity, of exemplary theologically exemplary pastoral care, and of faith-filled Christ-like witness. Translating these now into 2020 COVID speak is entirely another matter. The 2020 COVID epoch has drawn into such sharp relief and with frightening intensity all of the long-standing, historically rooted, deeply attitudinally and structurally embedded systemic inequalities which have traditionally and intentionally militated so cruelly, so unjustly, against those racially and thus economically predestined for the underside of life. As has become shockingly, starkly, finally irrefutably clear, certainly albeit in vastly different degrees of severity, neither of our respective societies are unconditionally inclusive, neither largely are they havens of exemplary pastoral care, and our public witness as Anglicans has for too long been mostly either reactionary, selectively benevolent, politically tentative. Beyond our own geographic boundaries in so many of the places of greatest human suffering in the world, our engagement has been mostly negligible, preferring as we do to restrict our witness to within denominationally prescribed tribal boundaries. Ironically, COVID has of course also been the great leveller, the mercilessly cynical catalyst for laying bare the reality of human interdependence. Tribalism in this respect has its constraints. With COVID, unless all are free of disease, then none are ever again able to be truly free. Here then, in the COVID 2020 pastoral vineyard, are the multiple political, economic, environmental and cultural challenges and complexities, which must now be known and understood with deepest intimacy, which must now be traversed with utmost skill and sensitivity, and which must now be addressed with fearless, faith-filled and public health-filled urgency. COVID 2020 then presents us all as global Anglicans at once not only with our greatest pastoral challenge, but potentially, I believe, our greatest redemptive moment. But then, and I ask again, do we, as global Anglicans, even know where to start considering our own complicity in perpetuating so much of the sheer arrogance of imperialism, that which is at the heart of so many of the systemic inequalities giving rise to disproportionate human suffering, that which has been at the heart of countless acts of historical erasure? This redemptive moment of which I speak requires of necessity a prior willingness among global Anglicans to right now take very seriously the need to comprehensively review our own inglorious colonial history. We need to re-examine our irrefutable participation in aiding and abetting, both intentionally and unwittingly, the imperialist practice of mission driven by that most unholy of alliances between the cross and the crown. We need to understand just how that breathtaking historic arrogance was precipitate in ensuring the tragic erasure of the presence, influence and contributions of so many of those who were quite literally from that day to this, set upon, set apart, set aside. For it is my contention that unless we first hold up a mirror, we simply cannot achieve what Francis Cheney so kindly bids of us to do. Unless once and for all time we commit ourselves to examining the ways in which the colonial shackles of imperialism, elitism, racism, and sexism continue to inform and influence our ways of being Anglican in the world, we will both knowingly and unwittingly continue to act to exclude. We will both knowingly and unwittingly continue to falter in our pastoral reach, and certainly we will both knowingly and unwittingly continue to delimit the effectiveness, indeed the integrity, of our witness in the world. We need redemption from a past in which we have been undeniably culpable in perpetuating injustice. But we are very reluctant to undertake anything even faintly approximating a sort of colonial history audit of ourselves. Afraid of the shadows across our past, we prefer patronizing tokenism as a substitute to radical transformation. We prefer perpetual privilege to humble piety, and we prefer unfettered patriarchy to any other option. Let me confess here and now in the privileged context of your invisibility to me, that as a veteran Anglican theological educator, I have long held to the oft publicly expressed view that most institutional or seminary-based theological education throughout the Anglican Communion has been and continues to be inexcusably, inexplicably irresponsible in not taking the lead as it ought, in modelling theological education which invokes, indeed which insists upon the very sort of historical inquiry I am pointing toward. Apologies for the background noise. it's a small island community. I am all for radically disrupting our traditional, unapologetically Eurocentric approach to devising, delivering, and validating theological education for ministry of every kind. Seminary-based Anglican theological education is a behemoth system, which is outdated, outmoded, and unjust. There remains collective institutional failure to recognise just how monumental are the current epistemological insufficiencies, how diversity averse, how contextually barren, and how inexcusably resistant to being radically disrupted most Anglican seminaries still are. In all the years of my leadership experience, there was negligible willingness indicated among my global peers in Anglican theological education to collaborate with me, for example, in exploring the implications of how all elaborations of knowledge, including theological knowledge, always reflect dominant power interests. I would suggest that by us failing to interrogate this fundamental reality, then any project to establish scholarly practices committed to equitable and mutually beneficial forms of collaboration with subaltern individuals and with those from traditionally underrepresented communities will assuredly remain a forlorn hope. And so it has been that the long-standing Eurocentric hegemonies, so deeply entrenched in Anglican theological education, in their curricula, pedagogy, assessment and accrediting, they have all to date remained largely aloof from being exposed, disrupted, or transformed. Why are we apparently content to allow Anglican imperialism to perpetually render traditional seminary-based theological education so bereft of context, validity, creativity, relevance, of transformative power? Why does it not matter to us to become more appropriately polyvocal, receptive to and empowering of global cultures and epistemologies, especially given the more direct challenges to our beloved institution, such as the Occupy movement, #MeToo, and now most potently, Black Lives Matter? Why are we apparently not the least bit concerned collectively to critically address the colonial biases of our institutional base? These are, of course, not unique questions, at least not from those on the underside, those no less faithful, but those institutionally consigned to the fringes, away from where ecclesiastical power resides, away from where critical power-laden decisions are made, away from where the politics of deciding what properly ought to constitute Anglican theological education are traditionally transacted. Let me share, I am personally indebted, forever grateful, to those legendary South American liberation theologians, also to the Jesuits, to the early feminist, Asian, Black, and latterly Indigenous theologians, for it is they who first penetrated the Eurocentric stranglehold that had traditionally and for too long held academic theology in its thrall. Without their prolific, courageous, and incisive, culturally and liberatively based critique, there would still be no place for someone who looks, speaks, thinks, and acts theologically like me within the Academy. As it is globally, the number of Indigenous Anglican woman theologians is woefully few, let alone Black women, let alone. In spite of the profound gender and cultural aloneness of my professional position for virtually all of my 30-year seminary career, one of the reasons I have such unshakable faith in theology as an intellectual and faith-based discipline is because it has always seemed self-evident to me that of all the academic disciplines, with its unassailable literary franchise on all the good words, such as justice, freedom, liberation, equality, compassion, mercy, truth, kindness, and love, that theology, in the hands of faith-filled Anglican theologians, would surely be one of the first to be willingly opened to the post-colonial challenge of re-examining its hegemonic, North Atlantic-dominated intellectual tradition, one so uncritically perpetuated as an educational system of both the old and now the new technologically driven empire. Further, I've always believed that the primary focus of theological education ought not be abstract theorizing about the meaning of God, the history of the church, the personhood of Christ, the complexity of biblical studies, but should also, and yes, maybe even predominantly, be about a search for justice, for liberation and human transformation in the face of brutally dehumanizing forms of oppression and of markedly increased human suffering in the world. But finally, and perhaps of greatest motivational importance, is that I was blessed to be raised in a faith-filled Anglican home. I never, in my wildest imaginings, thought I would end up with globally recognized credentials in Anglican theological education, let alone in a seminary, let alone leading one. But along the journey, every single one of my Indigenous elders has urged me on in the pioneering task of upending years and years of colonialist-inspired theological education. In my lifetime, many of my elders have come to realize that their faith, whilst never in vain, was nonetheless betrayed by the legacy of so many of those early missionaries and colonial church leaders who came into our communities to do good and ended up doing very well for themselves at Indigenous expense. In my entire career, no one was more determined, more selflessly encouraging than my beloved Mother Zita, to whom I dedicate this lecture and the associated award. She was singularly fixated upon seeing me pursue my project to make the seminary I was privileged to lead transformed into a place of unconditional welcome and of enduring spiritual safety for Indigenous students, and thus for all students. Her father, a truly brilliant and eloquent Indigenous leader, had in turn been a student in that same seminary from 1924 to 1927. His experience of being prepared for Anglican ministry bore all the hallmarks of a deeply racist colonial imperialism masquerading as a theological education. My master's degree project explored the history of Māori student experience at my seminary from 1843 to 1990. It was also this deeply personal, deeply poignant experience which merely served to strengthen my resolve to do something, to end what was an indisputably shameful legacy of institutionalized, racialized educational injustice. So I'm guessing that by now it should come as no surprise to you all that the transformation of Anglican theological education into something more closely approximating the Micah ideal of doing what is good, and by doing what is required of us by God, is of deep faith importance to me. I want to just briefly share with you something I wrote a few months ago for the Council for World Mission Ecumenical Theological Education. It was a project I was involved in. And again, I was suggesting that at the heart of enduring institutional change is quality and preferably radically transformative education. So here in part is what I wrote, because I'm thinking as an Anglican, speaking as an Anglican educator, my heart is obviously in transforming our own situation. So what might comprehensively inclusive, culturally expansive, contextually embedded, justice-seeking, seminary-based theological education for the 21st century require of us, apart from doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God? Years of teaching, researching, and speaking on the subject have enabled me to identify 4 key attributes which I consider essential to enabling transformative theological educational work to proceed, let alone to flourish. These 4 attributes will of course be readily evident among staff, students and governors alike in those seminary communities where there is already deep and abiding commitment to radically realigning theological education toward meeting the urgent and unprecedented needs and demands of 21st century mission fields. My list of 4 is by no means exhaustive, but it is rather what I see as the most fundamental requirements to be taken account of before one can even begin the noble task of transforming what is into what ought to be. Firstly, transcendent imagination, or having both the capacity and the will to transcend things as they are. Far from being impotent, faith-filled human beings possessing immeasurable God-given agency have both freedom and obligation to act and think in new ways. We have both the responsibility and the gospel mandate to transform what is currently inequitable and thus unjust. We already know that much Anglican seminary-based theological education globally is currently seriously lacking in diversity and is thus seriously inequitable. It is this structurally embedded inequity which inevitably militates against effective pastoral outreach into the lives of those traditionally marginalised, those who are the least in any given society, those whose life chances are thus tragically delimited. Transcendent imagination inculcates a critical determination to refuse to see history as simply what took place, but rather to see it as what all people, irrespective of their particular context, are also now in the process of making and remaking. It enables an instinctive ability to stop trying to normalize the present and to stop seeing the future as a fait accompli. Both views negate the extraordinary political agency of real people, and both therefore lack in any real sense of hope. Surely, as Christian leaders and educators, we would want now to redress all extant inequities to ensure justice prevails within the academic household of God. Secondly, transcendent praxis. As Freire insisted, societal transformation cannot occur from a position of educational stasis. Rather, education itself must be an instrument of transforming action, a political praxis at the service of permanent human liberation. This does not happen only in the consciousness of people, but it presupposes a radical change of structures in which process consciousness itself will be transformed. In the new educational paradigm, the role of expert must be repositioned. Teachers and students together become inquisitive learners, empowering one another by their ability to produce knowledge and to challenge the knowledge that the old paradigm produced and presumed to be utterly sufficient. All existential realities have validity and are to be valued. It is in this way that curriculum deficit can be readily ameliorated in a mutually respectful and collaborative way. Christian leaders and educators need have no fear, but only gratitude, because the new form of authority that the new paradigm promotes draws on a variety of theological traditions in its unequivocal assertions that the greatest among us must become the servant of all. Thirdly, declericalizing and demystifying theological education. Encouraging and enabling theological education of lay people is not simply a counterpoint to clericalism, but rather is considered as a pragmatic solution to enabling desperately needed wisdom, insight and critique from maybe up to 90% of the church to enter into academic discourse, and thus to properly disrupt so-called unique theological truths over which global elites have for too long maintained total control. Imagine what a radically different intellectual harmony empowered and liberated lay voices might yet contribute into the Theological Academy. Fourthly, contextualization. Reinforced by the advent of globalization and the increased demand for inclusion and diversity, contextualization quickly became a fundamental characteristic of secular education. Secular education has thus led the way by underscoring, as it has, the essential redemptive justice requirement of enabling and validating multivalent voices, epistemologies, and imaginings. Anglican theological education has, as I have already intimated, continued to be a reluctant latecomer to the contextualization celebration, and indeed might otherwise remain so if not for the vigilance and relentless prophetic determinations of those of us who have miraculously emerged into leadership from the underside. Globally, the contemporary theoretical deployment of contextualization within Anglican seminaries is significantly uneven. The problem is often ethnocentrism and ecclesiastical hegemony. These two human constructs can, however, and must be intentionally deconstructed to avert the alternative phenomenon of contextual desolation. It is this insidious, ideologically rooted phenomenon of desolation that readily translates itself into attitudes of intolerance and mistrust, of increasing ecclesiological conservatism and confusion, of increased academic elitism, of neoliberal flight from public responsibility. There are countless other attributes unique to seminary-based theological education that can and must also be attended to. There is curriculum, there is pedagogy, there is assessment, there is environment, and within each of these discrete portfolios are many, many more layers of crucial importance. However, at this time, it seems much more important to deal with the spiritual obligations at stake, rather than dwell on matters of instrumentality. After bearing first-hand witness to so many of the desperately poignant, ongoing struggles for dignified self-determination across God's world, I cannot understand why there are still so many Anglican leaders with real power to effect real change, and yet who choose still to remain aloof from the unavoidably serious educational challenges which are surely implicit in every cry for justice, in every yearning for freedom. I do not understand how any church leaders can for a moment remain unaffected by the starkness, the horror, the sheer outrage of what are so rightly described as the global obscenities of our times. The too many poor, a massively eco-damaged planet, monumental levels of political corruption, wanton warmongering, human trafficking, preventable disease, religious bigotry, and right now, COVID-19. It is for all of these reasons that I remain utterly convinced that the ecclesiastical hegemonic and ethnocentric status quo of Anglican theological education must not remain as it is. I am in agreement with Freire insisting that a radical change of consciousness is imperative. Through the existential experience of dying to the current reality and being resurrected on the side of the oppressed, or by being born again with the beings who are not allowed to be. Any radically new theological education paradigm will, of necessity, undermine existing hierarchies of institutionally legitimated expertise, and so they must. Because while the majority of any educational discussion focuses of necessity on students and their learning needs, I remain adamant that teachers and governors must never ever be exempt from responding to any of the extant challenges that are now being so eloquently and urgently laid out by those traditionally denied access to the Theological Academy. Over the many years now of my academic leadership, I have found the greatest deterrent to radicalising minds and thus behaviours in favour of the least among us is the steadfast refusal of church leaders, of elite academics, of people with power over others, to forsake any of the considerable privileges of their ecclesial offices, whatever they may be. It would seem necessary, therefore, that just perhaps the hands, the feet, the hearts, and the minds of those with leadership responsibility are also in need of being reconsecrated for the uncommon underside work of making all things here on earth as they are to be in heaven. Remaking all Anglican seminaries as places of faith and where faith and scholarship meet to reimagine the work of justice would be a very fine gospel response to that work. Education requires relentless passion, a humanitarian vision, and a critical posture. It ought to stir the soul, expand the imagination, impart critical skills, energize the body, and secure justice, compassion, empathy, and ecological sustainability. Critical educators do more than simply study and transmit subject matter. They examine and critique social structures. They are intimately acquainted with community issues, and they are powerfully committed to helping others, especially those on the underside, to live meaningful lives. For those who, like me, either have been or still are in positions of seminary-based leadership, the critical questions remain. Have we the passion, the vision, and the posture to do this work? Have we the requisite attitude of daring to imagine a completely radically new way of being the theology we speak of and teach? Have we the courage to act boldly in spite of the costliness? Have we the depth and breadth of loving empathy needed to be fully, credibly present to any and all others, especially those on the underside? And have we the humility, the compassion, the kindness to actually be Christ-like? I leave the questions open. For now, I think Francis Cheney and I would have found a very happy accommodation of ideas and theological yearnings, because clearly you cannot instantiate unconditional and just inclusivity within any community or institution unless and until all forms of structural bias and attitudinal discrimination are eliminated. Therein lies our challenge as global Anglicans, particularly those whose lives and responsibilities are anchored in that most sacred of spaces, the life of the mind. I firmly believe we as Anglicans can do this urgently needed redemptive work, because clearly we have the faith-based intellectual capacity. We must do it, because to live with injustice is theologically indefensible. And I think we will do it, because in our heart of hearts, we Anglicans are justice-seeking human beings. We love nothing more than gathering to worship, to meet together, to break bread together, to gossip, to laugh, to be still in the presence of God and of one another. And all of this because we know that in the sanctity of togetherness, there is nothing more precious than the God-given deep reassurance of human touch, the indescribable joy of human warmth, the exquisite and enduring tenderness of human love, the very things all of humanity was created to give and to receive, the very essence of being fully human. Let me suggest then that our task as the Berkeley Yale family of God is to ensure all, and not just some in the world, are being accorded every single one of the rights, opportunities, and freedoms needed in order to be fully human in this extraordinarily challenging 2020 plus season of life we are all now living into. We can, we will, and we must. I want now just to conclude with a very, very brief but very beautiful prayer from the New Zealand Prayer Book. Lord, Holy Spirit, in the love of friends, you are building a new house. Heaven is with us when you are with us. You are singing your song in the hearts of the poor. Guide us, wound us, heal us, and bring us always, always to God. Amen. Warm greetings from a tentatively spring time in the South Pacific. I am so deeply honoured to be both a privileged participant in your convocation and a profoundly humbled recipient of a much coveted award from Berkeley Yale Divinity School. I know, as for all of us, the dramatic shift to a virtual gathering experience is significantly disconcerting. It is so counterintuitive to the human spirit not to be able to see one another, to delight in proximity, and yes, even in embrace. And for those of us who are technologically inept, it becomes even more challenging, especially when expert help is nowhere at hand. So this little addendum to the Cheney lecture is just by way of me expressing my very, very sincere gratitude to Berkeley Yale Divinity, especially to my greatly esteemed colleague and treasured friend, Dean McGowan, for drawing me in so warmly and for affording me such abundant virtual hospitality. For this, I have no words, only a heartfelt response of reciprocal commitment. For now, as one of the newest members of the Berkeley Yale family, I too accept I have a duty of care, a duty to do all I can to advance the gospel call to be God's mission people in the world. These are not easy times for any of us, but as always, our greatest strength is in our God-given togetherness. So I look forward to the day when I am physically able to be with you. But until then, let us take heart in knowing we are indeed surrounded by the great cloud of witnesses, urging us ever onward toward standing for justice and for always being exemplars of God's grace-filled compassion. Across the oceans and the mountains and the valleys between us, I send every blessing of love for this convocation and for all that lies ahead, now for my school and for yours, Berkeley Yale Divinity.
I know you'll want to join me in thanking Dr. Jenny Te Pā-Daniel for her stirring and challenging Cheney lecture for 2020. Dr. Te Pā-Daniel, as you heard, has exercised a remarkable range of leadership roles in the Anglican Communion, and her passion for the Anglican Communion as well as her hope for its future are evident in what we've heard. I hope that in the year ahead we will all be able to reflect more on the message she's given us and think about how here at the school, as well as further afield, we're able to live into the challenges that she has offered. Thank you for joining us for the Cheney Lecture for 2020. Good night.